The bridges around Bandar Abbas are gone. Not the port, not the naval base sitting on the water, the roads out of the city, the concrete spans that carried fuel and missiles and men north toward the rest of Iran, dropped into the dry riverbeds overnight. 6 of them, maybe more, in a single stretch of hours. And once you understand why those particular bridges and not the ships or the launchers or the radar dishes everyone assumed would come first, you start to see the shape of what Washington is actually trying to do. This isn't a strike anymore. It's a siege drawn with a map and a bomb sight. Here's the part that should get your attention before anything else. When you want to destroy an army, you hit its weapons. When you want to strangle one, you hit its roads. The United States just chose the roads. And the reason that choice matters to you, sitting in Ohio or Arizona or wherever you're watching this from, is that the same waterway these bridges lead down to is the waterway that sets the price of the gasoline in your tank. It's Friday, July 17th, 2026. The air over Hormozgan province still hazy from the fires, and the story tonight is not really about Iran. It's about what happens to a global economy when the biggest choke point on Earth becomes a battlefield nobody can leave. This is Professor Alex, and if you want the version of this story that follows the money instead of the noise, take 1 second and subscribe, then let's get straight back into it. Because the bridges are the tell. For 6 straight nights, U.S. Central Command had been doing what everyone expected: missile storage, launch sites, air defense, coastal surveillance, the kind of targets you hit when your stated goal is to stop Iran from threatening ships in the Strait of Hormuz, which has been the official mission from the start. Predictable. Grim, but predictable. Then, on Thursday into Friday, the pattern broke. The strikes moved off the launchers and onto the infrastructure, the highway spans, a railway junction just west of Bandar Abbas, and the tower at a port down the coast in Chabahar, which reportedly came down entirely. Iranian state media says at least 8 people were killed and around 20 wounded in the bridge attacks. That number comes from Tehran's own outlets, so hold it loosely, but the strikes themselves are not in dispute. CNN geolocated one of the damaged bridges from footage Iran's own broadcaster released. The Khurestan span, cut. Now ask the obvious question. Why would a campaign that's supposed to be about ships suddenly start bombing highways? The answer is the whole story. Bandar Abbas isn't just a dot on the coast. It's Iran's main commercial port, and it's home to the headquarters of the Revolutionary Guard's Navy, the same force that has been stopping tankers, mining the approaches, turning the Strait of Hormuz into a place ships are afraid to go. You can bomb that base every night for a week, and Iran can keep resupplying it, keep rotating men and missiles down from the interior, keep the pressure on the waterway alive, as long as the roads hold. So Washington stopped trying to break the base and started trying to isolate it. Cut the highways north toward Shiraz, cut the rail line, turn a port that feeds off the rest of the country into a port that has to survive on what's already inside it. One Iran analyst, Hamidreza Azizi, framed it plainly. The point is to disrupt the movement of Iranian forces in the south, strangle the logistics, and the naval threat in the strait withers on its own. That's the logic. It's cold, and it's coherent, and it tells you this campaign has an objective beyond making noise. And it's worth pausing on just how much weight rests on this one city, because the name won't mean much to most Americans, and it should. Bandar Abbas is not a minor harbor. It is the largest port in Iran, the place where the majority of the country's container traffic comes and goes, the gateway through which an enormous share of what Iran imports actually enters the country. Layer the military on top of that commercial spine, the Revolutionary Guard's naval headquarters, the fast boats, the anti-ship missiles that make the strait dangerous, and you have one location doing 2 jobs at once. It's the artery for goods and the fist that controls the waterway, in the same place. That's exactly why it's been a target since the opening days of this war. Back at the very start, in late February, satellite images showed fires burning across that same naval headquarters, black smoke rising off the water, vessels ablaze. What's different now isn't that Bandar Abbas is under attack. It's that the attack has changed shape, from trying to burn the base down to trying to wall it off from everything that keeps it fed. But roads don't only carry missiles. And this is where it stops being a purely military story and starts becoming something with a humanitarian edge, that nobody in Washington is putting on a slide. Those same bridges carry food, fuel for civilian cars, medicine. Bandar Abbas isn't a garrison town, it's a city, sitting in a province of ordinary people in a country of 90 million. Other routes are still open. The reporting is careful to note that. This isn't a sealed box yet. But the strikes could widen, and the direction of travel is clear enough that you can see where it's pointed. And late this week, for the first time in the entire campaign, Iran's energy ministry admitted something it had been quiet about for days, that its power infrastructure had been hit. It asked people in the southern provinces to use less electricity, in the middle of a heat wave. Read that twice. A government telling its citizens to ration power in extreme heat because the grid that keeps their air conditioners and their water pumps running is under attack. That's the human cost sitting underneath the strategy. Keep it in mind because it's about to collide with the second half of this story, the half that lands on your credit card statement. Let's follow the oil. Everything I've described so far is about Iran's internal plumbing. The bridges, the rail line, the grid, that's Tehran's ability to move its own military around its own country. Important, but domestic. The thing that reaches across the ocean and touches your wallet is something else entirely, and I want to be precise about this because a lot of people are blurring the two together. The oil price is not spiking because of the bridges. The oil price is spiking because of the water those bridges lead down to. The Strait of Hormuz. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil passes through that gap between Iran and Oman in normal times. Some estimates put it closer to a quarter of all seaborne crude. It is the single most important 20 miles of water on the planet for anyone who buys energy, which is all of us. And right now, almost nothing is moving through it. Before this war, something like 130 vessels crossed that strait every single day. This week, after the United States reinstated its naval blockade of Iranian ports, the count dropped to about 7. 7 ships, where there used to be 130. Traffic fell to a 2-month low. The waterway didn't close with a headline or a formal announcement. It closed the way a road closes when everyone quietly decides it's too dangerous to drive. Insurers pull coverage. Captains reroute. Owners tell their crews to wait it out. And the oil that would have flowed through simply doesn't. Understand how that machinery works, because it's the part that turns a military situation into an economic one without a single additional shot being fired. A modern oil tanker is worth tens of millions of dollars, and the crude inside it can be worth as much again. No sane owner sends that through a war zone without insurance, and the insurance that covers war zones, war risk cover it's called, is priced by underwriters who watch the same news you do. When missiles start flying and ships start getting hit, those premiums don't tick up. They leap, sometimes by multiples, until for many operators the cost of the coverage plus the risk of losing the vessel outright simply isn't worth the trip. So they stop. The strait doesn't need to be physically blocked. It just needs to become uninsurable, and the traffic evaporates on its own. That's the quiet genius and the quiet danger of a choke point. You don't have to sink the ships. You only have to make people afraid enough to keep them home. So the market did what markets do when the supply of the most important commodity on Earth gets pinched. Brent crude, the global benchmark, closed Friday around $86 a barrel, up more than 10% on the week, its strongest weekly run in months. West Texas Intermediate, the American grade, tracked right alongside it in the low 80s. Put that in context. A year ago this was oil in the low 70s, drifting, oversupplied, with analysts writing notes about a glut. That entire narrative is dead. The word traders are using now is the one that always shows up at moments like this: risk premium. The market has stopped pricing the oil that exists and started pricing the oil that might vanish tomorrow. And I want to be honest with you about the ceiling here, because it matters. This is real strain. It is not yet the panic we saw earlier in this war. Back in March, when the strait first seized up, Brent tore toward 100, then past 110, and there were serious people at serious banks whispering the number 200. We are not there. 86 is elevated, it's uncomfortable, it's climbing, but it's not a market that believes the lights are about to go out. Part of that is fatigue. This conflict has been grinding since late February, and markets, like people, adjust to a threat they've lived with for months. Part of it is the emergency stockpiles that got released earlier. And part of it is a bet a bet that neither side actually wants this to spiral, that Trump wants cheap gas heading into the November midterms, and Tehran wants sanctions relief, and that somewhere in that shared self-interest, there's a floor under the chaos. That's the bet. The question is whether the bridges just made it a worse one, because here's what changes when you move from bombing launchers to bombing infrastructure. You lower the exit ramp. A missile site is a military target. Everyone understands why it got hit, and everyone understands that hitting it doesn't necessarily mean the war has to get bigger. But a power grid? A bridge a city depends on? A desalination plant? When you start attacking the things that keep civilian life running, you're not just degrading an enemy's army. You're raising the stakes of backing down. You're making it politically harder for the other side to walk away without answering. And Iran answered. Look at what Tehran did this week, because it's a mirror. As American bombs fell on Iranian bridges and power lines, Iran struck a power and water desalination plant in Kuwait. Think about what that is. Kuwait is a desert. It doesn't have rivers. A large share of the water its people drink comes from turning seawater into fresh water at plants exactly like the one that got hit. That's not a military base. That's the thing that keeps a country of humans alive in a place where nature won't. Iran also fired on Qatar, on Jordan, and carried out what's being described as its first direct strike on a base in Syria. Both sides, in the same week, quietly agreed to stop treating civilian infrastructure as off-limits. That is the escalation that should worry you more than any single explosion. Not the size of the blasts, the category of the targets. And there's a thread on the American side of this that ties directly back to your gas pump, so let me pull it. There are reports that Iran has told the Houthis in Yemen to get ready, to prepare to disrupt shipping in the Red Sea if the United States keeps hitting Iranian power infrastructure. Now hold that next to what the US just did. Washington just hit Iranian power infrastructure. So you've got one choke point, Hormuz, already strangled, and the threat of a second choke point, the Red Sea and the route up toward the Suez Canal, being loaded like a second barrel. Two of the handful of narrow passages that the entire global oil trade squeezes through, both under threat at the same time, because of a decision made this week about which targets are fair game. That's how a bridge in southern Iran becomes a number on the sign outside your gas station. Let me slow down and connect it all the way, because this is the part that actually matters for anyone who isn't a defense analyst. When Brent goes from the low 70s to the mid 80s, that's roughly a $15 move per barrel. That doesn't stay in the oil market. It flows downhill, into diesel, which moves every truck that carries every product to every shelf you buy from, into jet fuel, into the cost of the flight you were thinking about booking, into the price of gasoline with a lag of a week or two, because the fuel in the station's tanks today was bought at yesterday's price. The pump is a rear-view mirror. What's happening in Hormuz this week is what you'll feel at the pump next week, and the week after, if this holds. And it lands hardest on exactly the people who can least absorb it, the household already stretched, the retiree on a fixed income watching a bigger slice of the budget disappear into the tank, the small business owner whose margins were already thin before diesel climbed, and the timing sharpens the blade. It's mid-July. This is the heart of the American summer driving season, the weeks when demand for gasoline is already at its highest, when families are on the road and refineries are running hard to keep up. An oil shock that lands in a slow demand month is one thing. An oil shock that lands right when the country is burning through the most fuel it burns all year is another. There's less slack in the system to absorb it. The station that would have quietly eaten a few cents of a price rise in February passes more of it straight through in July, because everyone downstream is already stretched. And gasoline isn't a pure reflection of crude anyway. It carries the cost of refining, the cost of moving the fuel, the taxes stacked on top, and the station's own thin markup. But crude is the biggest single piece of that number, and when the biggest piece jumps $15, the sign out front follows. Not instantly, on a delay, which is its own kind of cruelty, because the pain arrives after the headlines have moved on, when you've almost forgotten why. This is the quiet mechanism of an oil shock. It's not a crash, it's a tax. A tax that nobody voted for, collected at the pump and the grocery checkout, on every mile you drive and nearly everything you buy, imposed by a war 10,000 miles away that most Americans couldn't find on a map. And the cruelest part is the timing. This is the Federal Reserve trying to thread a needle, watching for any sign that inflation is reigniting before it can finish the job of bringing it down. Energy is the input that feeds into everything. A sustained spike in oil is the one thing that can turn a slow, careful path back toward normal into a reversal. The Fed can't lower interest rates into an oil shock without risking the exact inflation it spent years fighting. So a bridge in Hormuz gone doesn't just move the price of gas. It reaches all the way into the decision about what your mortgage rate does next year, what your car loan costs, whether the cost of living finally eases or grabs hold again. All of it running back to a stretch of water 20 miles wide. Now step back and hold the whole board in your head, because the strategy underneath this is worth understanding on its own terms. What the United States appears to be assembling isn't one lever, it's four, pressing at once. There's the financial pressure, sanctions, the blockade, an economy already gasping. There's the naval interdiction, the ships turned back, the ports sealed. There's the logistical disruption we've been talking about, the bridges and the rail and the roads that let Iran move its own military. And there's the slow erosion of outside technical support, the specialists and the parts and the supply chains that keep sophisticated weapons working. Squeeze all four at the same time, the thinking goes, and you don't have to defeat Iran's military in a battle. You make it too expensive, too difficult, too isolated to keep fighting the way it has been. You grind the machine down until it can't turn. That's the theory. And that same analyst I mentioned, Azizi, floated something sharper, that the logistics campaign, the cutting of roads and bridges, could be preparation for something more than pressure, possibly the groundwork for a deployment of forces on the ground. I want to be careful here because that is speculation, not confirmation. Nobody has announced boots on the ground. But it's the kind of speculation that gets you to sit up straight, because if it's right, this stops being an air campaign with an economic edge and becomes the front end of something far larger. And a larger war in the Persian Gulf is not a scenario oil markets have anything close to fully priced. $86 is a market betting on containment. If containment breaks, that number does not stay where it is. So we're left with a genuinely open question, and I don't think anyone honestly knows the answer, including the people who ordered the strikes. Is this the end game or the overture? Because you can read what happened this week two completely different ways, and both are plausible. Read it one way, and cutting off Bandar Abbas is the last turn of the screw, the final bit of pressure designed to force Iran to the table, to make Tehran conclude that the cost of holding the strait hostage has finally outrun the benefit, and to set up a negotiation from a position of American strength. The interim agreement both sides signed back in June collapsed weeks ago. Maybe this is how you drag the other party back to sign a real one. Read it the other way, and this is the shaping operation before something worse. You don't isolate a port because you want to talk. You isolate it because you want it weak for what comes next. You cut the roads so that when the real move arrives, whatever it is, the defenders can't reinforce. Under that reading, the bridges aren't a message, they're a preparation. And there's a third possibility that's worse than either. The one that keeps the people who study these things awake. That nobody chose. That this isn't an endgame or an overture, but a slide. Each side answering the last blow with a slightly bigger one. The power grid for the bridges, the water plant for the power grid, the Red Sea threat for the water plant. Until they've climbed a ladder neither one meant to climb, and neither one can figure out how to get down. Wars rarely announce themselves as decisions. More often they're a series of responses that each felt reasonable in the moment and added up to something no one wanted. When both sides have already agreed, quietly, that civilian infrastructure is fair game, the rungs on that ladder are closer together than they've ever been. The unsettling truth is that the same set of facts supports both stories, all three of them, and we won't know which one we're living in until it's already too late to change it. What we do know is concrete. We know the roads out of Bandar Abbas are broken. We know the Strait of Hormuz has gone quiet, 7 ships where there used to be 130. We know oil closed the week near 86 and climbing, that the risk premium is back, that the glut everyone was talking about a year ago has evaporated. We know both sides have crossed the line into hitting the things civilians need to live, Iran's power grid, Kuwait's water. And we know that somewhere off the coast of Yemen, a second choke point is being loaded, waiting on a decision that may have already been made. Here's the thought I keep circling back to, and I'll leave it with you. For years, the assumption underneath the entire global economy has been that the Strait of Hormuz is too important to close, that the world needs that oil too badly, that no one would dare, that mutual necessity would always win in the end. That assumption is being tested right now, in real time, by a campaign that is methodically dismantling the roads around the port that controls it. And the price of oil, the number that quietly touches your groceries, your commute, your rent through the interest rate that shadows all of it, is now a live wager on whether that old assumption still holds. Maybe it does. Markets are betting, cautiously, that it does. But every bridge that drops makes the bet a little more expensive, and the exit a little harder to find. So the real question isn't whether the United States can isolate Bandar Abbas. It clearly can. The question is whether anyone involved still remembers how this is supposed to end, and whether the off-ramp is still there when they finally go looking for it.